He ventured closer to a butcher's stall drawn by the scent of meat. A scrap of gristle lay on the ground, perhaps dropped by a customer. Rusty darted forward, snatching it up. The taste, rich, salty, wonderful, exploded on his tongue. But before he could retreat, a heavy boot caught him in the ribs. "Thieving cur!" the butcher bellowed. The man's face was red with fury as he raised his cleaver. "I'll have your hide." Rusty scrambled away, the precious morsel still clenched in his jaws. Pain lanced through his side with every step, but he didn't stop until he was well away from the square, hidden in the narrow gap between two cottages. Only then did he allow himself to swallow the tiny piece of meat, barely enough to take the edge off his hunger. His sides heaved with exertion, and he tasted blood in his mouth, his own from where his teeth had cut into his gums during the butcher's kick. He rested his head on his paws, allowing himself a moment of self-pity. Sometimes, in moments like these, memories surfaced from the corners of his mind. Fragmented recollections of warmth, of a gentle hand, of a time before pain and hunger became his constant companions. Had there been kindness once? A home? Or were these merely dreams his mind created to comfort him during the coldest nights? The rest of the day passed in similar fashion. Twice more he was chased away from potential food sources, once by the cooper's wife wielding a broom, once by a gang of children who thought it great sport to corner him against the well and pelt him with ice and stones until he managed to break free, one stone catching him above the eye, opening a small cut that bled into his vision. The children's laughter followed him as he fled, their taunts carrying on the winter air. "Run, ugly dog! Hope the wolves get you! My pa says he'll shoot you if he catches you near our chickens!" As the short winter day waned, Rusty found himself near the eastern edge of the village, where the poorest residents lived in small, ramshackle cottages. Here, he was sometimes able to find scraps, the residents having less to waste but also less energy to chase him away. It was here that he spotted Anya for the first time. She stood in the doorway of a cottage no larger than many of the village's storage sheds. A small girl, perhaps 6 years old, with pale blonde hair escaping from beneath a knitted cap that seemed too large for her head. Her coat was clearly a hand-me-down, the sleeves rolled up to accommodate her small arms. She was watching her mother chop wood nearby, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Something about the child caught Rusty's attention. Perhaps it was the way she stood, still and watchful. Perhaps it was simply that she wasn't shouting or throwing things. Whatever it was, Rusty found himself observing her longer than was prudent. The mother straightened, rubbing her lower back. "Anya, go inside and stir the pot, and don't let it boil over this time." The girl nodded and disappeared into the cottage. The mother resumed her work, the rhythmic thunk of the axe punctuating the gathering twilight. Rusty turned away. Night was approaching, and with it, the more dangerous residents of Carvel would emerge from the tavern, full of drink and looking for amusement. More than once, such men had made sport of chasing Rusty through the streets, betting on whether they could catch him and what they'd do if they did. He needed to return to his den, to curl up and let sleep take him away from hunger and pain for a few blessed hours. As he limped through the gathering darkness, a familiar voice called out, "There he is!" The devil dog. Rusty's heart sank. He recognized the voice. Tavish again, but not alone. The baker's son was with a group of older boys, 5 or 6 of them, their faces flushed with cold and excitement. "My pa says he's rabid," one of them said. "Says someone ought to put him down before he bites a child." "Let's do it then," another suggested. "Village would thank us." Rusty didn't wait to hear more. He bolted, his injured leg screaming in protest, his bruised ribs sending shards of pain through his chest with each bound. Behind him, he heard the boys whoop and give chase. Under normal circumstances, even with his injuries, Rusty might have outpaced them, might have found a hiding place too small for humans to follow. But today, weakened by hunger and cold, his reflexes dulled by exhaustion, he was slower than usual. A stone caught him in the hindquarters. He stumbled, nearly fell. Another whispered past his ear. The boys were gaining. Rusty veered toward the forest, hoping to lose them among the trees. It was a risk. The forest held its own dangers, but right now, The human threat was more immediate. He crossed the invisible boundary where village gave way to wilderness, plunging into the shadows beneath the pines. The snow was deeper here, untrammeled by human feet. The winter winds howled through the narrow streets of Carvel, a remote village nestled between jagged mountains and dense forests, forgotten by progress and prosperity. Snow piled in dirty heaps against stone walls, and smoke curled from chimneys into the gray sky. In this harsh place, where survival demanded all one's energy and attention, there lived a dog named Rusty. No one had given him this name. No one in the village cared enough to name him. But if they had looked closely at his matted fur, they might have seen that beneath the dirt and grime was a coat the color of autumn leaves, of rust on old farm equipment, of embers dying in a hearth. Hence, Rusty he was, at least in his own mind, in those quiet moments when he had the luxury of self-reflection. He was neither large nor small, neither purebred nor completely mongrel. His lineage, like his early life, was a mystery even to him. What he knew was survival, the rhythm of the village, where to hide, when to emerge, and most importantly, whom to avoid. Dawn broke over Carvel, pale light seeping through heavy clouds. Rusty stirred from his makeshift den, a hollow beneath the rotting floorboards of an abandoned shed at the village's edge. His body ached from the cold that had seeped into his bones during the night. One of his back legs, broken years ago and never properly healed, throbbed with a familiar dull pain. His stomach contracted painfully, reminding him it had been 2 days since his last proper meal, half a rotten fish he'd found behind old Greta's cottage. He emerged cautiously, his nose twitching, testing the air. The village was beginning to wake. Smoke thickened from chimneys. Doors creaked open as men headed to work in the fields or the lumber mill that sustained Carvel's meager economy. Rusty knew the patterns, knew when to move and when to hide. The first human he saw that morning was Tavish, the baker's son, a boy of 12 with a perpetual scowl and cruel eyes. Tavish spotted Rusty from across the muddy road and immediately bent down, fingers scrabbling for a stone. "Filthy mutt!" the boy shouted, his voice cracking. The stone flew, missing Rusty's head by inches. The dog didn't wait for a second attempt. He limped away quickly, ducking behind the cooper's workshop. His heart pounded against his ribs. This was how most days began, with stones or sticks, with shouts and threats. Sometimes Rusty wondered why he stayed in Carvel, why he didn't venture into the wilderness beyond. But deep in his animal heart, he knew the answer. The village, cruel as it was familiar. The forest held unknown dangers, wolves, bears, the prospect of starvation even more certain than here. By mid-morning, Rusty had completed his cautious circuit of the village's southern section, keeping to narrow alleys and shadows. He'd found nothing to eat. The winter had been particularly harsh, food scarce even for the humans. What little they had, they certainly wouldn't share with a stray dog. He paused behind the village hall, where the smell of cooking came from the kitchen window. His mouth watered involuntarily. It had been so long since he'd tasted warm food. Through the window, he could see Mara, the cook, chopping vegetables for the daily communal soup that fed the village's poorest. Rusty edged closer, driven by hunger, forgetting caution for a moment. His paw crunched on a twig. Mara's head snapped up. Her eyes narrowed when she spotted him. "Get! Get away!" she hissed, reaching for the broom she kept by the door. "Filthy creature! You'll bring disease to us all!" The broom caught him across the shoulders as he turned to flee. A sharp, stinging blow that sent him tumbling. He recovered quickly, limping away as fast as his injured leg would allow. Behind him, Mara continued to shout, her voice carrying through the cold air. Someone ought to put that beast down. Nothing but a nuisance and a danger. Rusty found temporary shelter beneath the blacksmith's cart. His heart gradually slowed its frantic pace. The blow from the broom had caught him where another villager, Kern the tanner, had struck him with a length of pipe just 3 days prior. The area was tender, and Rusty knew without seeing that another bruise was forming beneath his matted fur. He licked at his front paw, where a thorn had embedded itself days ago. The pad was swollen and warm to the touch, another pain to endure among many. By midday, hunger drove him to the village square, where the weekly market was taking place despite the cold. Farmers from outlying areas had brought what little winter produce they had, root vegetables mostly, some preserved meats, woolen goods. The square was busier than usual. Villagers huddled in their worn coats, haggling over turnips and potatoes. Rusty kept to the perimeter, moving between carts and stalls, nose to the ground, searching for anything edible that might have been dropped. His caution wavered as his hunger grew more intense. Each step became an effort, the cold powder reaching his belly. Behind him, the boys' voices faltered. "He's going into the deep woods." "So what? Let's get him." "My pa says not to go in there after dark. Says there's wolves." "Afraid of wolves, Eric? Afraid they'll eat your skinny ass?" Laughter, but nervous now. The growing darkness, the silent trees had begun to work on their boyish bravado. "Come on, we'll get him another time. I'm freezing anyway." Rusty didn't slow until the voices had faded completely. Only then did he collapse in the snow, sides heaving, every breath painful. The forest was silent around him, the only sound his own labored breathing. He was safe from the boys, but now he faced a new problem. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and he was far from his den. The snow beneath him was already stealing his body heat, and his thin frame had little fat to insulate him. With a groan, Rusty forced himself to his feet. He needed to return to the village, to his small shelter. The forest was no place for him tonight. The trek back was agonizing. Each step sent pain shooting through his leg, and the cold had settled deep in his bones. By the time he reached his den, the moon had risen, casting the abandoned shed in silver light. Rusty crawled beneath the floorboards into the small space where old sacking provided minimal insulation. He curled into a tight ball, tail over nose, conserving what little warmth his body could generate. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, haunted by dreams of pursuit, of never-ending hunger, of a warmth and kindness always just beyond his reach. Few in Carvel ever bothered to look into Rusty's eyes. If they had, they might have been unsettled by what they saw. An intelligence, a depth of understanding that went beyond mere animal instinct. Rusty observed, remembered, calculated. He knew which houses had dogs that would bark at his approach, which villagers carried sticks, which alleys offered the best escape routes. He understood the rhythms of human life. When people rose, when they worked, when they returned home full of drink and prone to cruelty. More than this, he understood something of their hearts. He saw how hardship had turned many of them mean, how poverty had made them see threats where none existed, how fear made them lash out at anything different or vulnerable. In his more philosophical moments, during long nights when sleep eluded him, Rusty pondered whether they hated him because they saw in him a reflection of their own precarious existence, one misfortune away from being just as unwanted, just as desperate. Did they know that he watched their children play in summer, hidden in the tall grass, his tail giving the slightest of wags at their laughter? Did they know that he sometimes followed the oldest villagers home on icy nights, ready to bark an alarm should they fall? Did they know that he had twice chased foxes from the communal henhouse, receiving nothing but a thrown pot for his troubles? Probably not. To them he was merely a nuisance, a walking reminder of disorder in a world where order meant survival. Yet despite everything, the pain, the hunger, the loneliness, something in Rusty remained unbroken. Call it hope, call it stubbornness, call it the indomitable spirit that separates the merely living from the truly alive. Whatever it was, it rose in him each morning with the sun, propelling him from his den to face another day in a world that had no place for him. Sometimes, in the quietest hours before dawn, Rusty would find himself on the hill overlooking Carvel. He would watch the village sleeping below, smoke rising lazily from chimneys, and feel a strange emotion that, had he been human, he might have recognized as forgiveness. For all their cruelty, these were his people, his tribe in some twisted way. And deep in his heart, foolish as it might be, lived the belief that someday, One of them might show him kindness. Days passed, each much like the one before. The winter deepened. Snow fell, melted partially, then froze again, turning the village paths into treacherous sheets of ice. Rusty's existence narrowed to the basic quest for survival, finding enough food to keep starvation at bay, enough shelter to prevent freezing, enough caution to avoid the worst of human cruelty. Then came the night that changed everything. The day had been particularly difficult. A storm had moved in from the mountains, bringing biting winds and horizontal sleet. Few villagers ventured outdoors, meaning few opportunities for Rusty to scavenge. By nightfall, he was exhausted and empty-bellied, his injured leg throbbing worse than usual from the cold. He was making his way back to his den, keeping close to the buildings for some shelter from the wind, when a sound caught his attention. Raised voices coming from the small cottage where he had seen the girl, Anya, and her mother. Rusty paused, ears pricking forward. He couldn't understand human words, of course, but he recognized tones: anger, fear, distress. The door of the cottage burst open, and Anya ran out, her small figure immediately buffeted by the wind. Her mother appeared in the doorway. "Anya! Come back this instant!" But the child continued running, her arms wrapped around something Rusty couldn't identify. She disappeared around the corner of a neighboring house. "Anya!" The mother's voice held real fear now. She stepped out, looking in the direction her daughter had gone, then back into the cottage, clearly torn. A man's voice called from inside, angry, slurred with drink. The woman's shoulders slumped. She cast one more desperate look in the direction Anya had fled, then went back inside, closing the door. Rusty hesitated only a moment. Then, driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand, he began to follow the girl's trail. Her small footprints were already being filled in by the falling snow, but his nose told him which way she had gone. The trail led toward the eastern edge of the village, and then, alarmingly, beyond it, toward the forest. Rusty quickened his pace, ignoring the pain in his leg. The child was heading into danger. The forest was no place for anyone on such a night, let alone a small girl. He picked up her scent near the tree line. Fear, tears, determination. She had entered the forest here, not running now but walking steadily as if with purpose. Rusty followed, the snow deeper here, the wind howling through the pine branches overhead. For nearly half an hour he tracked her, his concern growing as they went deeper into the forest, further from the village lights. The storm was worsening, visibility decreasing by the minute. How far would the child go? Did she have a destination, or was she simply running away? Finally, he spotted her, a small figure huddled against the trunk of a massive pine. She was clutching a cloth bundle to her chest, her face buried in it. Her shoulders shook with sobs. Rusty approached cautiously. The wind was blowing toward him, so she had not yet detected his presence. He stopped several yards away, uncertain. Humans, in his experience, reacted unpredictably when startled. Would she scream, throw something, run further into the forest? While he hesitated, the decision was made for him. A gust of wind swirled the snow around, carrying his scent to the child. She looked up, her tear-stained face registering surprise, then fear. "Go away!" she cried, her voice thin in the howling wind. "Bad dog, go away!" Rusty didn't move. He lowered his head slightly, his tail giving a tentative wag. He'd learned over the years that this posture sometimes placated hostile humans. Anya stared at him, clutching her bundle tighter. Now that he was closer, Rusty could see that it was a doll, crudely made from scraps of cloth, missing one button eye. "I said go away," the girl repeated, but with less conviction. She wiped her nose on her sleeve. "I'm not going back. They want to take Masha away." She held up the doll. Rusty watched, still motionless. "Father says we can't afford to keep her. Says it's just a stupid doll." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "But she's not stupid, she's my friend." Rusty took a cautious step forward, then another. The child didn't shout again. He was close enough now to see that her lips were turning blue, her small frame shivering violently. "Are you a bad dog?" she asked, her voice small. "Everyone says there's a bad dog in the village. They say you bite." Rusty took another step, then slowly lowered himself to the snow, his belly touching the cold ground, his eyes fixed on hers. It was a position of complete submission, one that went against every survival instinct, making him vulnerable to attack. But something told him it was the right thing to do. Anya watched him, wariness giving way to curiosity. "You don't look very bad," she observed. "You look—" She searched for the word. "Sad." Rusty's tail gave another small wag. The wind gusted again, bringing with it a fresh swirl of snow. Anya shivered, hugging herself and the doll. "I'm cold," she admitted, "but I can't go back. Father will take Masha." She looked around, as if seeing her surroundings clearly for the first time. The forest stretched in every direction, dark and forbidding. The storm showed no signs of abating. For the first time, fear crept into her voice. "I don't know where to go." Rusty understood her predicament more than she could know. How many times had he faced the same dilemma? Nowhere to go, nowhere to belong, no safe haven in a hostile world. But while he could survive a night in the forest, this small human could not. The cold would take her before morning. He rose stiffly, his joints protesting, and took a step back toward the village, then looked at her expectantly. Anya shook her head. "I told you I can't go back." Rusty took another step, then stopped, waiting. "You want me to follow you?" she asked. He couldn't answer, of course, but his intent gaze spoke volumes. Anya hesitated, looking back the way she had come, then around at the dark forest. The decision seemed to form slowly on her face. A recognition that whatever awaited her at home, it was preferable to freezing in the wilderness. "Okay," she said finally, her voice small, "but I won't let them take Masha." She struggled to her feet, her limbs stiff with cold. Rusty waited patiently, then began to lead the way back toward the village, keeping his pace slow to accommodate her shorter legs. They had gone perhaps halfway when the distant howl reached them, cutting through the storm's noise. Rusty froze, hackles rising. He knew that sound. Wolves. And not just any wolves, the big timber wolves that roamed these mountains, fierce and usually wary of humans, but perhaps made bold by winter hunger. Anya heard it too. "What was that?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. Another howl answered the first, closer. Then another. A pack, and they were moving in this direction. Rusty made a quick calculation. At their current pace, they wouldn't reach the village before the wolves found them. The storm had covered their tracks with snow, but it wouldn't matter. The wolves would catch their scent on the wind. He needed to find shelter, and quickly. His eyes scanned their surroundings. Through the whirling snow, he spotted a formation of rocks about 50 yards off their path. It wasn't ideal, but it might offer some protection. A place where they could put their backs to stone and face only one direction. He nudged Anya's hand with his nose, then moved toward the rocks. "Where are you going?" she called, confused. "The village is that way." Another howl, much closer now. The child's eyes widened with fear. "Wolves," she whispered. This time, when Rusty moved toward the rocks, she followed without question. The formation turned out to be better than he had hoped. A small cluster of boulders with a narrow opening that widened into a space just large enough for the girl to sit with her back against stone. Not a cave, but a natural shelter of sorts, with room for Rusty to stand guard at the entrance. "In here?" Anya asked, peering into the dark space. Rusty gave a gentle push with his nose. The wolves were coming closer. He could smell them now on the wind. The girl crawled into the shelter, clutching her doll. Rusty followed, turning to face the entrance. Outside, the storm continued to rage, snow building up around the opening, actually helping to insulate the small space. Anya huddled against the rear wall, shivering violently. "I'm so cold," she said, her teeth chattering. Rusty hesitated only a moment before moving to her side, pressing his thin body against hers. His own coat was wet with snow, but his body heat was better than nothing. To his surprise, the girl didn't push him away, Instead, she wrapped one arm around him, pulling him closer. "You're warm," she murmured, burying her face in his damp fur. They sat that way for some time, the howling of the wolves drawing ever nearer, the child and the dog sharing what little warmth they possessed. "You're not a bad dog at all," Anya said after a while, her voice sleepy. "You're a good dog. A brave dog." Something stirred in Rusty's chest at her words, a feeling long forgotten, a warmth that had nothing to do with physical heat. How long had it been since anyone had called him good? Had anyone ever? The moment of warmth was short-lived. A new sound reached them, the pad of feet on snow, the low growl of a predator who has found its prey. The wolves had arrived. Rusty rose, moving to the entrance of their small shelter. Through the swirling snow, he could make out shapes. 1, 2, 3 wolves, their eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the storm. Big animals, lean with winter hunger, but powerful. Behind him, Anya stirred. "What is it?" she asked, fear threading through her voice. "Wolves," she whispered, the word barely audible over the wind. "They've found us." Rusty positioned himself in the entrance to the rocky shelter, his body blocking the way to the child. The lead wolf, a large male with a scarred muzzle, bared its teeth in a silent snarl. The message was clear: step aside. The human is ours. In another life, perhaps Rusty would have obeyed the instinct for self-preservation. He was outnumbered, outweighed, already weakened by hunger and cold. The odds were insurmountable. But something had changed within him. Behind him huddled a child who had spoken kindly to him, who had called him good, who had trusted him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, someone needed him. He answered the wolf's snarl with one of his own, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. His message was equally clear: you shall not pass. "This dog? This is the stray? The one from the village? He saved me, Papa. He found me and brought me to these rocks. He fought the wolves. Please help him." The man was silent for a moment. Then, to Rusty's surprise, gentle hands lifted him. "We need to get them both back to the village. Quickly." As consciousness slipped away, Rusty felt himself being carried through the snow, heard the urgent voices of the searchers, felt the small hand of the child touching his fur. His last thought, before darkness took him completely, was one of wonder. So this is what it feels like to be valued. The awakening warmth. That was the first sensation that penetrated Rusty's awareness as consciousness slowly returned. Warmth and the absence of pain, or at least a dulling of it, as if his injuries were wrapped in layers of cotton. He opened his eyes to unfamiliar surroundings. He lay on something soft, a blanket, he realized, folded into a makeshift bed. Nearby, a fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting flickering light and warmth throughout a small room. The air smelled of wood smoke, cooking, and human habitation. He was inside a house. The realization sent a jolt of alarm through him. Houses meant humans, and humans meant danger. He tried to rise, but his body refused to cooperate. Even the slight movement sent pain lancing through him, sharp enough to cut through whatever had been dulling it. "He's awake!" a child's voice exclaimed. Anya's voice, Rusty realized. She appeared in his field of vision, her face alight with relief. Behind her stood her mother, expression cautious but not hostile. "Be careful, Anya. He's badly hurt, and he might be frightened." Anya knelt beside Rusty's makeshift bed. "It's okay, Defender. You're safe now. Papa brought you home. The healer came and fixed your cuts." Rusty's mind struggled to make sense of the situation. He was in the cottage he had seen Anya enter and exit many times, but why? Why had they brought him here? Why were they helping him? As if reading his confusion, Anya continued, "You saved me from the wolves. Papa says you're a hero." She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wished, and gently stroked his head. "Everyone knows what you did. The whole village is talking about it." Rusty closed his eyes, leaning slightly into her touch. Hero. The word meant nothing to him, of course, but her tone conveyed approval, gratitude, kindness, all things so foreign to his experience that they seemed almost unreal. The door opened, and Anya's father entered, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes went immediately to Rusty. "So he's awake, is he?" "Good." The healer wasn't sure he'd make it through the night. The man approached, kneeling beside his daughter. Up close, Rusty could see the resemblance, the same pale hair, the same serious eyes. "I owe you an apology, dog," the man said quietly. "We all do. The things we said, the way we treated you." He shook his head. "If you can understand any of this, know that I'm ashamed and grateful. You saved my daughter when I couldn't." Rusty watched him warily, but there was no trace of the anger he had heard in the man's voice the night Anya ran away. Instead, there was something new, respect. "What happened to Masha?" Anya asked suddenly. Her father's expression softened. "Masha can stay. I was wrong to try to take her from you." The child's face lit up. She hugged her father, then turned back to Rusty. "Did you hear that, Defender? Masha can stay, and so can you. You can live with us now." Live with them? The concept was so foreign to Rusty that he couldn't quite grasp it. Live in a house with humans who didn't chase him or throw things? It seemed impossible. Yet as the day wore on, the impossible began to seem real. Anya's mother brought him water in a bowl. Clean water, not from a puddle or ditch. Later there was food. Actual food, meant for him, not scraps rescued from the mud. They changed the bandages on his wounds, their hands gentle, their voices soothing when he whimpered in pain. And there were visitors, other villagers, coming to see the dog who had saved the child. Rusty recognized many of them. The baker, whose son had thrown stones, the butcher who had kicked him, Mara, the cook, who had chased him with a broom. Now they stood in Anya's cottage with gifts, a ham bone, a blanket, apologies. "We didn't know," they said again and again. "We didn't understand." Through it all, Anya remained by his side, her small hand often resting on his flank.